If you had a microscope and could look at a piece of a leaf, you would see thousands of tiny openings which branch out until the leaf has all of the materials it needs. What happens now?
Hello, and welcome to lesson number 3. I hope you have a large coffee or tea, because today we're going to talk about a lot of stuff. But I think it's going to be a really fun lecture. I'm going to talk a lot about Photoshop and Illustrator and the way those two powerful pieces of software integrate with After Effects, okay? This is obviously a really big topic. And even more specifically, I'm going to talk a lot about how to import layered artwork from Photoshop and Illustrator into After Effects so that you can work with those layers and animate them individually, okay? This is also a really big topic, all right? I'm also going to talk about pre-comps, which is something that we've never discussed before, but which I think is kind of important, and it's something that I'd like you to get used to right away. A pre-comp is essentially if you take one composition and put it inside of another composition, right? So you can have parallel compositions, all of which have animation going on inside of them, all at the same time in After Effects. All right? It actually sounds a little more complicated than it is, and I'm going to show you how that works, and I really do want you to integrate that into your After Effects workflow eventually, okay? Because there's just some things that you have to do that way, right? Finally, I'm going to walk you through animating a logo, which is very much like what you're going to do for your homework, okay? I'll take you through all the steps on a really similar logo, all the way from Photoshop and Illustrator, where I kind of made the artwork, and then all the way through a finished animation. And once I'm done, we're going to have some real fun, because I'm going to show you some effect in After Effects and how to take the black and white artwork, which we've imported, and make it into full color, like awesome logo artwork, right? So we're going to use some color correction effects and finally get into that, all right? So it's going to be a lot of fun, and we're going to learn a lot. Before we get going, I just have to explain like some really key sets of rules about making artwork for After Effects, which we haven't done yet because I've either given you the artwork or you've made it inside of After Effects. We haven't really created artwork and then brought it into After Effects yet as part of this class. So there are two really important rules when doing that, and we need to go over those now. One is artwork always has to be RGB, okay, which is a color mode, and not CMYK, all right? And if that doesn't make any sense to you, don't sweat it. But if you're from a print design background, that makes a lot of sense to you, okay? Because CMYK is the color space that you need for printing things, right? But making, color for a monitor, which is essentially, a light source, and for print are very different. And so, we need to always work RGB, which is the color space we need for any kind of monitor or screen or for the web or anything like that, okay? RGB, not CMYK, that's rule number one. And the second rule is 72 pixels per inch and not anything higher, okay? After Effects only works at 72 DPI or PPI or however you want to say it, and not anything higher. Again, that probably, if you're not from a print background, you don't care about this, but if you are, print needs a much higher resolution for it to work, like 360 or greater, but TV, the web, anything else that's on a monitor is always 72 pixels per inch, okay? So those are the two rules. RGB and 72 pixels per inch. And by the way, if you try to import non-RGB art like CMYK or grayscale art into After Effects, it won't let you, all right? So it's RGB only. Whereas if you scan something, for example, or create artwork that's 300 DPI, it'll allow you to pull it into After Effects, but it'll just bust it down to 72 DPI anyway, so it won't make a difference, okay? So I just wanted to explain those things right off the bat, and then let's talk about some of the presets for making art in Photoshop and Illustrator. And let me just explain really quickly that if you are going to make your own artwork in Photoshop, I definitely think you should do it this way, okay? When you go to make a new document, it launches this kind of little window here. And then up here are your presets, all right? And I want you to go to Film and Video and click on that, right? And then basically there are some fairly similar looking presets for HD TV, but just make sure, okay, that it's HD TV 1080p. The P in this case stands for progressive. Don't worry about it. It's the same thing. And just make sure that it's 1920 by 1080 and 72 Oh, I guess it's PPI also in Photoshop now, okay, not DPI. I guess they changed that, right? Some of these other settings, you know, they look similar, like HDV, but if you look at this, it's 1440 by 1080, so that's not what we want. So just make sure, and also this one's very similar looking. It even says HDTV, but that's 720p, which means it's 1280 by 720, and not 1920 by 1080, okay? So you would hit create, and I just want to point out one other thing about this, which is, like I said, 1920 by 1080 pixels, right? Always oriented horizontally, okay? Although sometimes maybe you do a job that way. I have one time in my whole career, right? And like I said earlier, 72 pixels per inch, and RGB, okay? And background contents, I like white. But the important thing to remember always, 1920 by 1080, 72 pixels per inch, and RGB color mode, all right? Once you do that and use that preset here, HDTV, you should be fine for making your own artwork in Photoshop. Okay, now we're actually looking at the new document screen for Illustrator. That's if you hit Command-N on either one of these, okay, and you see these new document screens. And they're very similar looking, okay, so they're easy to mix up, but they kind of work basically the same way, right? Which is that up here you have, you know, presets, all right? And in Illustrator, what I want you to do is click on the film and video one, right? And then again, kind of like before, just make sure, like this HDV 720, that's not what we want. We want HDV 1080, okay? Make sure it's 1920 by 1080, not 1280 by 720. When you click on this, again, 1920 by 1080, oriented horizontally, right, and RGB color. Now, what I prefer with illustration settings is to press this More Settings button, which opens this, okay, and I prefer to set the transparency grid to off and not have that, you know, gray and white transparency grid, which I find is rather distracting of a thing to design on, okay? So that's just if you're making Illustrator and Photoshop artwork, which you don't really need to do for this class, but I just wanted to roll you through how you would do that just in case and keep all of the settings perfect, all right? So let's move on. Okay, so this is what I'm going to be working with today for this lecture, and it's a kind of fake logo that I made for a hat company. And obviously it's kind of hipster, and it has that kind of mustache shape that hipsters apparently seem to love. The important thing about this is that I've created it all in layers, okay? So here is my hat layer, for example, which I've also named all the layers, which is super, super important of a thing for you to get used to doing, because as you work more and more in After Effects, you're going to start working with projects that have maybe hundreds of layers, okay? And if they're all named like layer 1, layer 7, layer 17, you're going to go crazy trying to figure out which one's which each time you need to change something. So definitely, starting now, always name your layers, okay? You could do it here in Photoshop, and if you forget here in Photoshop, you could do it in After Effects too, okay? All right, so moving along, here's my hat, all right? And if I click on this eyeball shape here, I will turn this on and off so it can be viewed, okay? And really, again, just to emphasize two very important things, and this works in Illustrator, in Photoshop, and in After Effects, so it's kind of a universal Adobe thing, that A, things need to be on their own layers if they're going to be animated separately from one another, okay? So that's one important point. And two, the other very, very important point that you have to get conceptually, which possibly makes sense to you right away, but I just want to say formally, okay, is that anything in this layer stack here, anything that's on top of something else is above it in the layer stack and above it visually on the artwork. Okay, this is really important. So for example, I have my Harry's Hats type here. And this is actually a reference because I'm going to swap it out for a different type later in After Effects. But nonetheless, to prove this point, this layer here, okay, I'm going to turn it on and off so you can see it. This is above my banner here, okay, and this banner is solid here. So if I were to take my type and put it below here, below this layer or below any of these layers at the bottom or whatever, okay, that type, well, I didn't do it. That type now disappears because literally this banner is on top of it. I know this seems really obvious, possibly, and I hope it seems really obvious, but this is just a really important point that you have to get kind of right away about all the Adobe products. Whatever's on top in the layer stack is physically on top of the other objects. Okay? It's just an important thing for you to get. Second, okay? Now, I said this before, but I think this bears repeating. Anything that needs to animate on its own, independently of the other layers, needs to be put on a separate layer, okay? Again, this is a super important concept. So, for example, here I have my mustache, and you might think that that would animate as one, but what I'm thinking is it might be kind of cool if the mustache can kind of like rotate a little bit up and down from its own center, so it has a kind of that kind of action a little bit, you know, that kind of flapping action might be fun to put in it. So what I did is I broke these two down into separate layers, okay? If those were one layer, it would be impossible actually in After Effects without cutting it up in After Effects to have it kind of bend in its own middle, right? So it's just a really important thing to remember. Anything that animates on its own needs to be broken down into its own layer, okay? So, and that brings us to another special thing about Photoshop that we don't have in Illustrator, but which works really nicely with After Effects, okay? In Photoshop, you have these groups. They look kind of like folders. I tend to call them folders. If I call them folders, you know I'm talking about a group, okay? But in these groups live other layers, okay? So you can kind of like flatten layers down into one layer called a group, or a folder, which I sometimes call. But then within there, you can have the individual layers preserved so they can be animated separately as well, okay? So this is kind of a really important thing, and I've done this with both my banner, which I have the top and bottom lines, and then these little like diamond shapes separated out, and then the actual kind of solid banner itself, right? And similarly, if I turn that off, for these background lines, I want these all to animate separately. So in this group, right, you can see here, I've given them all a discrete name, and I've put them in order so that it's a little bit easier to deal with. And now I've collapsed those into this one group so that in Photoshop it's just one layer. And you'll see the way this integrates with After Effects in 1 second. It's kind of special and kind of awesome. All right? So just a little bit of an overview about Photoshop and Illustrator is that they are layer dependent. Anything that needs to be animated should be on its own layer, and any layer that's on top of another layer covers that layer to some degree or other in the visual order. Okay? Similarly, here in Illustrator, I have broken just the type down. I'm kind of setting this up as a special example to show you how you can import and mix and match layers from Photoshop and Illustrator in one composition. Okay, so I'm just sort of doing it this way. So in Illustrator, I've broken down this type so that each letter is on its own layer, right? And the reason why I've done this, again, is just because I want to animate each letter to move independently, right? So if they were all on the same layer, I could only move it kind of as one layer. So now I can move each one independently since they're all kind of their own separate objects. All right? So let's talk about importing, which is kind of seems like it's not a very sexy topic, I know, but actually I think it really is. It's kind of the real lifeblood of how to work in After Effects. So importing is a huge deal. So it is really sexy, actually. It's damn sexy. Okay, here we are in After Effects, and I'm cracking myself up. Let's Command I to import. And actually, before I do that, I should note that something important for you to know about After Effects is the difference between opening things and importing things, okay? So in After Effects, you open projects, and you import layers of art into those projects, okay? So the shortcuts are Command O to open, and again, that's to open a whole project, and then Command I to import, and that's to import anything, photos, layered artwork, audio, video, anything, okay? So you Command I import all that, all right? So let's do that. Command I, okay, and that opens up an import window for us. And here's my PSD, my Harry's Hats PSD that I was just showing you in Photoshop. And the important thing to know about this process that's actually very important is there's this sort of little button down here that says Options. And when you click on that, it gives you a couple of options which are kind of important for us to talk about. After Effects gives you 3 different ways, essentially, to import layered art. Or anything, actually. Not just layered art, but import anything. You can import as footage, which means that you're collapsing all of your layers down to one, or if you're importing something that only has one layer, for example, a song or a photo or something like that, or a layer of video, for example, you would import it as footage. That means it pulls it in as one layer, okay? But in this case, we want to import layered artwork, so we want to go with one of these other options, either importing it as a composition or as a composition and retaining layer sizes, okay? And there are differences between all of these. So actually, let me show you how they all work. Okay, so let's first do what we wouldn't want to do and import this as footage, okay? So I'm going to hit open, and it's going to open another little window over here, okay? And it's sort of like it knows that you're trying to import layered artwork, and it's sort of like, are you sure you want to import this as footage? Because it looks more like a composition to me or whatever, but let's just go ahead and make it say footage, okay? Even here, we now have a bunch of options, okay? In general, and this is something I'm going to talk about for the rest of this class, After Effects wants to give you a ton of options, okay? It's almost like an options application. It is so open in terms of what it wants to let you do that that's kind of what makes it extraordinary and also really complicated. But nothing's that simple in After Effects in a way, because it wants to give you a million options of how to do things, and because some people need really specific things. All right. So one of these is, in this case, even if you're importing as footage, you can import all of the layers as one merged layer, right? So if you wanted to take the whole Harry's Hats things and just flatten it down to one piece of artwork, that was a PSD, you would import it that way. But believe it or not, you can even get in here and choose individual layers in your Photoshop document to import. This is a little bit more of an advanced thing. You might or might not need to do this, but just so you know, this is an option. You can always do that and just bring in one layer if you want. So that's pretty cool, all right? So let's go ahead and choose Merge Layers and Footage and hit OK, just so you can see what this looks like, all right? So now here it is. It's one layer, and as you can tell from the thumbnail, it's kind of got all of the artwork there. And if I were to take this, and it's still 1920 by 1080, that's how I set it up in Photoshop. I use the preset. So if I take this and I drag this down into my little composition icon here, it will open that in a composition. Now it will also call it what the Photoshop layer was called. And now here you see, here are all my layers compressed down to one. And now this is only useful if I want it as this one layer, but now, because now if I were to like animate this hat or something, I can't, because I've just got the whole thing all together, right? So that's that, all right? That's importing as footage. I'm going to delete this from here, and I'm actually going to delete both of these here. And yes, I do want to delete them. Okay. So now let's try Command-I importing this as a composition, okay? So I find it here again, and I hit Options again, and Import as Composition, okay? And there are still these two options, but first we're going to just try Composition, all right? And I'm going to hit Open, all right? And now it's like, are you sure that it's a composition? And you say, you know, yeah, it's a composition. It's still giving you those three options, sort of like the, you know, the fail-safe. And now even here, it's saying you can, giving you two options. You can importing as editable layer styles, or you can merge the layer styles into the footage. In this case, let's just work on editable layer styles and not really worry about this merging layer styles. That's more of like a Photoshop After Effects handshake kind of a thing, if you want to bring the actual layer styles that I used in Photoshop, which you rarely ever do. So editable layer styles is great. Okay, so let's hit OK. Now this is often more how you would import layered art, obviously. And here's what it looks like. It gives you the composition here. Again, it's 1920 by 1080 because of the way I set it up. And it's defaulting to 25 seconds and 29.9 second frames per second. So here we go. So it's got this composition here, and then it gives me this folder with all my layers in it. Okay, and here you go. Here are my layers, like the mustache right and the mustache left, etc., the hat and everything. It also has given us those groups, if you remember, which I sometimes call folders. And here are those groups, the banner PC and the background lines. And now this is really cool. It's actually imported those, what were groups in Photoshop, and turned them into different compositions. You see, it's got the same composition icon that you'd see there, or here in like my Make a New Composition button, right? It's got that little film strip with the, looks like a green triangle and a blue circle and a red square or something, right? That icon means composition, okay? And this is something we're definitely going to focus on today a little bit, but a composition within a composition in After Effects is called a pre-comp, which stands for pre-composition, and it's sort of like the composition that's before the composition that you're in now, in a way, in terms of order. It's like pre because it's sort of before it, all right? So we're definitely going to talk a bunch more about that and what that means and stuff, but I just want to show you on import, anything that was a group in Photoshop becomes a pre-comp upon importing to After Effects. Okay, we'll go over that again more, just showing you the different imports. And now if I double click on my main comp, okay, you'll see here are all my layers again, pretty much just like in Photoshop, all labeled just like they were in Photoshop, which is why it's so incredibly important that you label everything, right? And in here, these are my pre-comps again, and it gives it that different icon, right? And if I were to double click, for example, on my banner pre-comp here in my project window, now it'll open this composition here. Now you see I've got tabbed compositions going on, by the way. This is how it works. And you can't really tell here, but if I press this button, I will toggle the transparency grid in the background. And now we can see all of our layers, okay? The black that was on there is just a default. It doesn't mean it's actually black in the background, right? In fact, this one is transparent, right? But here you go. You can see now the lines and the diamonds and the banner, exactly like the way I laid it out in Photoshop. It opens in After Effects the exact same way, same names, right? So After Effects and Photoshop work really, really, really well together, and pretty much the layers look exactly the same names and everything, so it's extraordinarily useful, right? And the only other thing that I want to mention is that we're slowly talking more and more about anchor point, but it's kind of important in this stage. When I import as a composition the way I just did, the anchor point for every layer defaults to being in the center of the composition, okay? This is the primary difference between those two composition import settings, okay? Composition retain layer sizes and composition straight, okay? Is the main differences are, for my hat layer, for example, it works this way for all of them, it put the anchor point in the very center of the comp and not in the center of the hat, okay? And what that also means is, in terms of information, this layer is a 1920 by 1080 layer, okay? So what that means is it contains the information for the hat right here, and then it contains a lot of blank space in the shape of this composition, and that's exactly how After Effects knows where this layer kind of goes here, okay? It puts the anchor point in the center, and it lines everything up for all the layers, so they line up perfectly. So the anchor point's in the center, and the layer is the size of the entire composition. Okay, if that doesn't make total sense, I think it'll make more sense if I delete all this. Okay, I'm going to delete these. I'm just going to hit delete, and yes, I do want to do that. Okay, and now let me Command I and import this for the final time, and I'm going to hit Options, and we're going to import as a composition and retain layer sizes, and I'll show you the difference there. Okay. Sometimes there's a lot of confusion about the difference, especially these bottom two, and let's just walk through that right now. So composition retain layer sizes, I'm going to press open, right? And let's just go composition retain layer sizes and editable layer styles. I don't really want you to worry about this. This is definitely a more advanced thing, okay? So hit OK, and now it looks kind of the same, right? It's done all the same things. It's got my composition here, and it's got all my layers, and it's got my pre-comps, right? Now, here's one difference right away, is if I click on my hat, you'll see that the hat, which in the previous way of importing was a 1920 by 1080 layer, right? Now it's a 383 by 342 layer, okay? If I double click on the composition, we'll see that the hat's in the same place, but when I click on it, we'll see two differences, right? The anchor point is now defaulting to be right in the center of that layer, which is different. And also, like I said earlier, this is now a 383 by 342 layer. So as I click on this, we can see that there's a bounding box, or the box that shows kind of the edges of this footage layer are no longer the entire composition size. They are just the layer size. Okay, so that's kind of what that means, is You import it as a composition, but the individual layers retain their individual layer size. Okay? And the anchor point defaults to being in the center. All right? So that's the only difference between those two things. And really, sometimes you want it to import one way, sometimes you want to import one of the other ways. It really depends on what you're doing. Obviously, if you want to collapse everything down to one layer, then you import as footage. But if you want things in layers, you do have this choice of composition or composition retain layer sizes. It's a personal choice. Some people find it very, very useful, and I do too, for the anchor points, generally speaking, to default to being in the center of the object. That's usually more where you want it than just sort of randomly in the center of the composition. So there's that. And also, I believe, though I'd have to check this, but I believe that when you import and retain layer sizes, you actually create a slightly smaller amount of work and smaller files for After Effects to deal with, because you're not bringing in just, say, 10 1920 by 1080 layers. You're bringing in just, say, 10 350 pixel layers or whatever. So they're kind of smaller. So I think that's a little bit easier for After Effects to deal with, which probably won't make a difference in this case, but if you're dealing with many, many, many hundreds of layers, it could slow down your machine. Okay? So that's kind of the import differences. For this particular piece of art, for this, I think I'm going to import and retain layer sizes. I think that's totally fine in this case. The only disadvantage there that sometimes happens is, I don't think this is going to happen in this case, if, for example, you, instead of double-clicking this and showing the composition the way it's laid out in Photoshop, if I made a new composition and made it 1920 by 1080 with all the same settings, right, okay, and hit OK, now if I took all of these layers, or even just like, let's just show my hat and the type and the banner layers and stuff, if I took all of these and I dropped these into the comp, it centers them all in the center of the comp and centers them all together. So you see it has not preserved the artwork that I made. It only preserves the artwork when you double click on the main composition. Now, if you had imported and not retained layer sizes, and you pulled those things in, it would have put them in the correct placement of where I had put them in Photoshop, because the anchor point defaults to being in the center, and it's got the whole bounding box of the whole composition around it. It kind of knows where each layer goes. So in this case, I think importing and retaining layer sizes is going to be fine. So I'm going to keep it this way, just like I had just imported. Let me just quickly roll through some of the differences between Photoshop and Illustrator, because they're pretty different, and the way they work in After Effects is slightly different, so you should kind of understand the difference. Okay, so Photoshop is pixel-based or bitmap-based, which means that if you zoom in all the way on a Photoshop document, you'll ultimately see square pixels of color. And those pixels are what make up the artwork. When you zoom all the way back, it looks continuous, but if you zoom all the way in, you can see discrete pixels, okay? Illustrator works quite differently. Illustrator is vector-based, which means that after Illustrator only kind of, it determines points, and then it determines kind of the best line between those points, which are called vectors, but the only information that it really saves are the points, okay? Which is a little bit of an obscure way of saying that Illustrator art can be scaled up indefinitely, okay? Because it's not made of little pixels that just look huge when you scale them up. It's made more out of vector information that is determined by the computer, so it'll kind of keep recalculating the sharpness of the vector lines for you. Okay, hopefully that was not too technical or weird, but just remember vector versus bitmap or vector versus pixel, and you'll get the idea. Now, After Effects is pixel-based, like Photoshop, which means here in After Effects, if I zoom in on something, ultimately I can see the actual pixels that make up the artwork, all right? So here we have a typical example of Photoshop artwork that I've imported to After Effects versus Illustrator artwork that I've imported, okay? So kind of right away you could see kind of visually what the difference is that in general, and certainly the way that I illustrate in Illustrator versus Photoshop, is that Illustrator artwork tends to be kind of flat and vectory and clean. And Photoshop artwork tends to be photo-based, textured, and generally speaking, a little bit dirtier and a little less clean, okay? And when it comes to importing and working with these different kinds of artwork, they're basically the same except for one major difference, okay? In any Illustrator artwork, for example, in my pop layer here, if I show this solo, I'm just talking about this, okay? This button, by the way, is the solo button, and it will just show whatever layer that is on for. And you can also turn it on for multiple layers at the same time, so solo might be a misleading word, but anyway, that's what that button does, okay? So if I show the scale property of this ice cream pop here, right? And then I take, and of course it defaults to coming in at 100% of the scale. And if I take this and now I make this larger, okay? And I make it considerably larger, right? Just say that big. It's almost 1,000% bigger, right? Now you can see that this looks all crappy right here, right? You can see the limitations of the artwork breaking down, right? Now, because this is an Illustrator layer, there's a way to fix this, and it's really easy. And the way to fix this is basically just clicking on this one button right here, okay? This looks like a little sunburst kind of thing to some people. It looks like other things to other people. We don't have to get into that. If I click this on, right, we can see that it's on for the layer. And now you can see here that that is super sharp, perfectly sharp. In fact, we could scale this up infinitely, and those curves would stay nice and sharp as long as this button is pressed, okay? So without it pressed, it looks terrible, and with it pressed, it looks perfect, right? So just to reiterate, this only works for Illustrator layers because they're vector-based, okay? But for any Illustrator layers in After Effects ever, if you want to scale them up above 100% of the size and keep them looking good, you have to press this button, which is called the Continuous Rasterization button, which is not a name that rolls easily off the tongue or makes any sense, but it's just continuously being rasterized, which just means that you can keep it to stay sharp all the time, okay? And I'm going to just make this back to 100% of the size, back there. Okay, so that goes for any Illustrator layers. Now, for Photoshop, that is not the case. So if I take, just say, my red circle here in Photoshop, this one, which I will solo, so you can tell what I'm talking about, all right, that one, and I take that and I scale that up. I'm going to press S to reveal the scale property, right? And I scale this up now also to just say 1,000. Oops, I typed 100. 1,000, okay. And we look at it here. You can see, again, that this looks totally, utterly pixely and crappy, right? And unfortunately for this, there is no button there like that one to press. So with Photoshop layers, I'm going to undo that, right? Photoshop layers, you cannot scale them up above 100%. Maybe you can scale them to like 102 or 105 or something and get away with it, but a discerning eye, even at that small of a scale increase, will be able to tell that it's a little pixely. Okay, so what this means is if you have Photoshop artwork that you want to be really big in After Effects, what you need to do is create it really big in Photoshop, essentially, right? Because you can always make things smaller, but with Photoshop, you can't make them larger in After Effects. So if you need something to just take up a large percent of the 1920 by 1080 screen, just say you have a character, and then for some shot you need them to like get really close so you can just see their face on screen. You need to design that character huge so that the face alone will fill a 1920 by 1080 screen, right? So that's kind of like the way that you have to go back and forth in terms of sizing between After Effects and Photoshop. With Illustrator, you don't have to worry about that at all because of the continuous rasterization. Another difference between Illustrator and Photoshop artwork in After Effects is that for my vector artwork, my Illustrator artwork, After Effects, even though it's pixel-based, it can work perfectly with vectors, and it actually is aware of the vectors that are going on behind the scenes. So, for example, I'm going to turn my pop layer off to work with this circle. It's just a little bit of an easier example, right? So this circle, if I right-click on this, okay, I will, or if I control-click on it, I can see this other menu here. And there's a Create Shapes from Vector Layer option. Obviously, you would not get this with Photoshop, but only with vector art, which is from basically almost always from Illustrator. It could be a PDF as well. Okay, so if I create shapes from Vector Layer, right, it turns that layer off, and then it actually creates a shape layer from that sort of an internal After Effects layer that's the exact same size and the exact same color. And the only difference is you can see here that the continuous rasterization button that we had to put on for the Illustrator layer when we scaled it up above 100% is now kind of permanently on and grayed out. You can't ever turn it off. And what that means is shape layers, those created natively in After Effects, do not have to worry about rasterization. I can scale this up as much as I want, and it will keep that artwork always looking really sharp and really good. Okay, so that's another thing you can do with Illustrator layers, is convert them in After Effects to clean vector layers within After Effects, which is sometimes very, very useful. Okay, so that covers the basics of importing to After Effects, as well as the main differences between Photoshop artwork and Illustrator artwork, especially when it comes to After Effects. Okay, so now let's talk more about Harry's hats. I'm going to animate this, and you can watch, and this is very similar to your homework. So one of the things I really want to start by talking about is these pre-comps again, just in case this is a little bit confusing. You know, these pre-comps represent different comps that have different layers in them, but all of these run parallel with one another in time. After Effects does a really good job of keeping the time kind of paralleled for all of these comps and pre-comps. So for example, right now we're at 22 frames in our main comp here, Harry's hats. If I double click on my banner to open it, right, it keeps me at 22 frames. So for example, if I were to take all my layers here and have them start on this frame. So I'm just going to roll them back and hit Shift and kind of click them here so that the frame before, they're not there and now they're here, right? And now if I use this tab and go back into my main comp, right? It kept me, by the way, at the same time that I happened to be at, which was 117, right? Back here, just to make that point again. So now if I roll through my main comp, we can see at that exact frame, frame 22, now these layers kind of start and you can see them, right? So this is kind of how you work, is you can put animation in these pre-comps and then line them up in your main comp so that everything seems to be happening at once. But this is actually, it makes it much easier in some sense once you get used to it, because you just have to deal with like a few layers at a time here, and then you kind of set that and you know, okay, that animation's perfect, and then it's just this one layer in your comp. So it's kind of flattened down. It's just a little bit easier, right? I'm just going to jump into my banner and I'm going to undo that, right? Just roll these back to the beginning, and I'm going to close that for now. There's a tiny little X here that is what you have to press to close those tabs, right? So the first thing I want to think about is my background, this pre-comp. So let's jump in here and see how this is built. Right now, this is actually on a transparent background, right? Because the background here is this BG layer that I made in Photoshop, right? So this color here is just a reference color that After Effects put on it. And if you want to change that, by the way, if you press Command K, you can open your composition settings, and then this is my background color. It actually defaults to black usually. I just set this because I thought it would be a little bit easier to see these stripes, but you can always change it to whatever you want. And that color, again, it's not really there, it's just a reference, but sometimes it's very useful. Anyway, so here I have 16 layers that represent these various stripes, okay? And I kind of had the thought to animate them so that they kind of alternately came on screen like this, and then this, sort of in a kind of in a zipper-like way, kind of coming in from off the sides and into the center, alternating sides that it comes from, okay? So let's try this out, and I think we can use this again to talk about anchor point, because just like with our little bar that you did in the first homework, I think probably the most elegant way to make these zoom across screen is just to use a scale animation and move the anchor point over. We could do it as a position animation where this just kind of like moves in and lands, but I just find that kind of position, I don't know why, I think this scale thing is just a little bit more of an elegant way to go here. It does mean, however, that we have to change the anchor point for all of our layers here, for all 16, that might seem like a really lot of layers for you to have to work with, but in your motion graphics career now, I think you should start to get used to the idea of having to make a lot of adjustments to a ton of layers. That's just part of your life now, sorry to say. So hopefully you're not intimidated by that. One thing I'm going to do to make this easier, because my idea was to have, like, just say this layer come in from, from the left and move over to the right, and then have this layer, be the opposite and sort of move to the left from the right. So I think what I want to do is just grab each just alternating layers, and I'm just going to color them so that it's a little bit easier at a glance for me to understand what I'm doing. So I just selected all the even ones, and I'm going to click on this colored square, and I'll make these yellow so it's highly visible against the purple layers. And now I'm just going to go through these real quick and set the anchor points for each one. And I'm going to do that same thing where I press Y, or I choose my pan behind tool, right? And I'm going to move the anchor point and kind of get near the side here, and I'm going to hold down on Command and click it into place there, right? And I'm pretty sure that from the first homework assignment this makes sense what I'm doing, and that from here I'll be able to unchain this and make a scale animation like this, right? Okay, so let me quickly just do this work. And I'm going to go to the next one. I'm going to press Y again for the pan behind tool, and I'm going to move this over and click it there, right? And I'm just going to do that for all of them. And the purple ones are going to go to my left, and the yellow ones are going to go to my right. Right? And this is probably going to be somewhat boring for you to watch, but I don't care. Get used to it. And I'm almost halfway done. See that? It's really not that big of a deal. This command click thing makes it so much easier. I think that After Effects used to not have this, or I was not aware of it. And you used to really have to get in there, make guides, and like line everything up, and just definitely took a few extra minutes. And look at this, I'm rounding the home stretch here. Definitely color coding made this a lot easier, also because it could be easy. It's very easy to kind of forget which side it should go on. So there we go, awesome. Now that that's done, actually that's kind of the most amount of work I think this is going to really involve, because I think now I can just make one scale animation for one layer and then just copy and paste it to the rest. So let's give that a try. Okay, so maybe this should take about, I don't know, I think this should be pretty quick. Boom. So I'm going to try 10 frames. And if I hit Shift and page down, I will jump 10 frames toward that side of the comp, toward the end of the comp, right? So that's kind of nice. I'm going to hit the stopwatch, right, to make a scale keyframe. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here and go back to the beginning. Now, I've already unchained this because I just demonstrated this, so I just need to take my X position, make this 0, and that does that, right? And now I think all I need to do is select these two keyframes and copy them, and then basically just select all of my other layers and Command V, paste, yep, and look at that. If I press U on all the layers, now I can see that they all just kind of like roll on like this, right? So that's pretty cool, it's sort of fun. But let's take this one step further and add some overlapping action here. Because, it'd be more cool and more unique looking if each one happened like a tiny little bit after the next one, right? So I'm actually going to move in here to the beginning and zoom in a bunch. I'm pressing plus, right? Just so I can sort of see my frame designations here. So I'm pretty close. And I'm going to take all of them, which are selected, all the layers, except the top one, which is already not selected. I'm just going to move this back one frame here. I guess that's one frame, yep. And then I'm going to hit Command, and I'm going to deselect the top one. All the rest are still selected. And I'm going to move that over one, deselect it, move it over one, Command, deselect it, move them all over one, etc. Right? And you see what I'm doing is now I'm building kind of a chain, a staircase as it were, of these layers so that they're all starting one frame after the other ones. And it's not too difficult to do this, 16 times. Whoops. There we go. Awesome. Now I'm going to zoom back, and I have to widen out my work area a little bit. Press N, and I'm going to make a RAM preview and check that out, right? So that looks way cool, I think. Cool, so let's jump back into our main comp here, Harry's Hats, and we can check that out in this comp. Now nothing else is animated, but we can already see that this is a really strong start, okay? Let's talk about our banner pre-comp. So let me double click on that and open this up. And there's, actually I'm going to turn this transparency grid off because there's a couple of black layers here that are otherwise impossible to see. So I want to talk about something important here, which is masking, which is a new concept that I want to bring up that's actually one that's very, very important in After Effects. You can put a mask on any layer in After Effects, except for audio, I guess. But any video or photograph or, you know, graphics or layered art or anything you want, you can mask. And these masks can also be animated. They don't have to be. Sometimes the most useful use for a mask is just to, for example, I kind of did this on purpose. These two lines here, I want them as separate art, but when I brought them in from Photoshop, I didn't separate them. Okay, so I could use masks now to separate these so that I can create individual kind of layers out of them. And so let's do that, and then I can actually show you how to animate those masks as well. So first things first, if I select my lines layer, and I've soloed this off, so I'm just looking at that, and I choose my rectangle tool, okay? Now, with nothing selected, if I choose my rectangle tool and I draw on the screen, I will make a shape layer, right? We haven't really talked about that too much, but that's how you make a shape layer. But if I have a layer selected and I choose my rectangle tool, now I'm engaged in it as a mask tool, believe it or not, okay? So when I move over my layer, and I start to click and drag on this, you can see that I'm creating this sort of orange mask. And wherever, I haven't let go yet, so wherever I kind of set this, that will then be masked. Okay, so now, in other words, this lines layer has a mask on it, this orange thing, which is revealing only the top one of the two lines. Okay, and the reason it's doing that is because it's an add mask. If I were to make this a subtract mask by going down here, oh, and by the way, this little menu opens up right away, the mask menu, when you create a mask on a layer. If you don't see it for whatever reason, you can always just press M, and that will show you your mask as well. So as I was saying, right now this is an add mask. If I made this a subtract mask, it would show the other one, okay? Because now what it's saying is, whatever's outside of this orange box, that's what I want to put on screen. And when it's an add mask, it's saying whatever's inside of this box, that's what I want to put on screen, right? So very useful. I could take this now and I could press Command D to duplicate this lines layer, right? Now, just say if I had lines 2 on the bottom and I pressed M to show the mask and I selected this mask. And by the way, I can change the color of a mask by clicking on the little color field here, which opens this, and now like I could have this be my pink mask, so it's easier to distinguish that way. If I click on my pink mask, I can now drag this down, and now this add mask here is showing the other line that was in the original art. Okay, so now let me just to make that really clear, lines, I'll turn these other layers off so I don't have to solo these right now. Okay, lines, what used to be lines now only shows this one line, okay? And I made a duplicate copy of lines, which is called lines 2 now, and I masked it so that this one only now shows this line, okay? So that's great. I was able to split that art up into 2 layers, which looks perfect and looks exactly like it used to. But now I can animate them separately, and I was only able to do that in After Effects using masks, right? So that's one really good purpose for masks, is for kind of separating layers, for cutting a little part out of a layer, or for just including one part of a layer that might have multiple parts. Okay? Like I said, I can also animate these masks, which is pretty cool. I'm actually going to rename these now that I have a top and a bottom line. I'm going to select this one, and I'm going to press return, and I'm going to write top line here, and press return again. And then go here, press return, and write bottom. Oops. Bottom line, okay? I just really like to make things nice and clear. So I'm going to, let's go to like frame 20 here. So let me click back a couple frames, and Now I'm going to select both these and I'm going to press M again. M is in mask, and this will show me my mask path. And what I want to do is click on the mask path stopwatch for both layers, and that will now set a keyframe that, for this mask shape, for the path of the mask. Okay? So if I roll back, just say to frame 10 now, 10 frames earlier, what I can do is I can kind of animate, I can change this mask shape, and that will create an animation of the mask, right? So before I do that, I think the way I want this mask to animate, before I just do it, I want to actually figure out how I want it to animate. And what I was kind of thinking is that all the layers are in the background are coming on, side to side, and that means they're coming on from the edges and toward the center. So for the most part, good animation happens when multiple things on screen are kind of all acting harmoniously together. Not necessarily all in perfect lockstep, but if in general things are kind of moving left to right, then other things might want to enter left to right as well, because it creates a sense of just rhythm and what's known as reinforcing screen motion. Okay, so what I was kind of thinking is that this mask could animate these two lines to sort of start maybe in the middle and move out, or this one could animate on in this direction and this one can animate on in that direction. So they're kind of mimicking, in this case, the two lines. So let's do that actually. So what I want to do now is with my top mask, I'm going to select my mask keyframe, but I could also just select the mask, and I want to, okay, this might be a little bit hard to understand, but now every point on my mask, see these boxes here, these are called points, mask points, okay? And right now they're all selected. So if I were to select my mask, I would be moving every point of the mask at the same time. And that would make a new keyframe, but that's not exactly what we want. What we want to do is, I want to hit Shift and select just one of these mask points, okay? And you see now that has deselected that mask point. So now these three are selected, which is not what I want. What I want is to select this one, which I can now do, having it, because it was unselected, now I can select it. Now you see the other three are deselected. And now I can hit Shift again and click on this point, and now both of those are selected. Okay? So however you do it, that's a good way to, you pretty much always need to use Shift to kind of deselect and then select other mask points. It's a little bit clunky, but that's the way you have to do it. So now that I've moved in time and I've got my mask handles, selected. So what I need to do is drag this back in this direction. I'm holding down Shift so that it moves straight and it doesn't move all over the place, because in this case I just want a straight animation. And I just need to move this to the point now that it's completely off the mask, right? And so now the animation just masks that on, which is pretty cool, right? I think that's pretty cool. So let me go here now to my other layer and do kind of the opposite thing. So I'm going to zoom in a little on my timeline, and I'm going to select this mask. And now again, all of the points are selected, so I have to Shift and deselect this one. And then what I could do, an additional thing that I could do now is kind of just draw a marquee over these two with my arrow, and now I've selected both of those, okay? So now I just need to drag these points this way until that mask is off now, and now I've created two different animated lines that are moving in opposite directions. Here, let's check this out. I will set my work area, and we can widen out a little bit and make a random preview. There you go. Might be a little bit hard to see. Those are moving kind of fast, so what we could do is kind of drag this back a little and maybe make them happen a little slower. Yeah, I think that's a little bit easier to see, but I think that's pretty elegant, right? So that's kind of fun, and I think you get that about the masks. Let's talk more about masks, actually. I will use a mask also to animate on my banner here, this big gray object. Okay. Now, you'll see that the mask tool is just the same as a shape tool, has these preset sizes and shapes that you can work with, right? Shapes, not really sizes. Circles, rounded, rectangles, polygons, and stars, okay? But what you want to do is more of a custom-made mask than that, you need to use the pen tool here, right? So if you're not making a really perfect circle or oval or something, you're pretty much often using the pen tool to mask things out, okay? So I'm going to choose my pen tool and my banner layer. And just so you can kind of see it, I'm going to solo that, right? And just for an example, this isn't what I'm going to do. Now with my pen tool selected, if I click a bunch of points in here, right? Now I've created a mask of those, of that shape on that layer, right? So you can kind of create kind of polygon mask shapes this way. I'm going to hit M and I'm going to select this and I'm going to delete that mask, okay? But I'm going to select it again and my pen tool. And so kind of the way I'm imagining this animation is this is moving outward from its own center, okay? And I like these end points being kind of, of the shape being kind of pointy here. So I'm going to preserve those. And what I'm going to first do is I'm going to use my pen tool to draw a kind of an outline of a mask around this so that it keeps it on screen here, right? And I could probably, I'll do this real quick. So here we go. I'm going to just go just a little bit outside my mask here, and I'm going to click there, and I'm going to click here, and I'm going to click here, and I'm going to try to keep these lines parallel to that line, right? And now I'm going to widen out a little bit, and I'm going to move down here, and I'm going to hold Shift and click down here so I made a straight line. And now I will click there and there somewhere, kind of keeping that very parallel. And now I will click back over here, right? So I've made a full mask. And actually, I'm going to undo that for one sec. Just when you're on your last mask path point, as you move over to the first point, you'll see that little circle that pops up on my pen tool. That means it's going to complete the circle of the mask, okay? Or the shape layer in this case, in a different case, but in this case, the mask. So I'm going to click on that and complete the mask, right? So now I see that it automatically opened this mask. It made it pink, and it's an add mask, okay? So let me go a little bit forward in time, and I'm going to twirl this down, and here are all of my mask properties. And I should probably explain these real quick, because mask path is not the only thing that's in this folder. There's a whole folder full of stuff, and these all are useful and have their own uses. We're only going to use mask path probably for most of this class, but mask feather and mask opacity and mask expansion are cool too, and sometimes will be great in a pinch. Mask feather, as the name suggests, will kind of create a feathered soft edge for your mask, right? And I'm going to put that back to 0, and that's sometimes really useful, especially like in compositing and where you're trying to like add kind of subtle things on screen that you don't necessarily want the audience to even see. So to be able to really finesse the edge of the mask is sometimes really useful. Opacity is, as it suggests, whatever's inside the mask you can change the opacity of, which is really useful. And mask expansion will allow you to sort of pull in or expand the mask out from its original point. Right. So we don't need to do any of those. I just wanted to explain that. But let's make a mask path keyframe by clicking on the stopwatch. And now I'm going to move back in time to about here, and we'll figure out the timings later. But actually, let me make this an even amount of timing. So I'm going to hit Shift and page up to move 10 frames, and then do that again. So now I've moved 20 frames. Okay. And additionally, I need to set a guide, because what I want to do is have these points all collapse in toward the center, and that being the animation is that it kind of expands out from the center. But first I have to kind of set the center. All right. So I'm going to widen out, and I'm going to click off my layer for one sec, press my V arrow, and now I'm going to go down here and look at this. We haven't talked about this before, but there's a little button down here, and if you press this, you can find this menu to see the title and action safe. And if you click on this, it gives you a nice center point, as well as showing you some other boxes here, which we'll talk about at some point, not important right now. But right now I just wanted to see the center here. So I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to press Command equals or Command plus to sort of zoom into the center. And I'm going to press Command R to show my rulers. And I'm going to grab from here and pull a ruler and set it right exactly at the center. So now I have a nice guide that I can work from. And I can actually turn this title action safety off now if you find that distracting, which I do. Now I've got my mask path keyframe set for here, and I've moved in time. So what I need to do now is that same thing where I need to kind of deselect one of these points because they're all selected now, and then I can just marquee around that and grab those three. Now these are unselected, and I'm going to shift and drag these back and kind of click these to the center. And now I'm going to zoom in to my comp window by pressing Command equals or Command plus, and I'm now going to shift and select this, deselect that actually, and then select it and drag this back so now this is in the center too. And I'm going to zoom way in, and I'm just going to click all these points so that they're exactly at the center. And just make sure they really click into the center there, okay? And I'm going to zoom back out. I'm going to do the same thing for the other side. Since this one is selected, now I can just marquee over these and select those, which deselect that. And now I'm going to drag these back and snap those into the center. And definitely make sure this goes right to that line, okay? And then I'll grab this and move that back to the center as well, right? So everything's on that line now, and I've made a new keyframe there. And so what does that mean? What did I just do? Check this out. Now it kind of opens up like that, and it goes from there where everything's in the center, and then the other points go back to where they originally started to this keyframe that I made, right, like that, right? So that's pretty sweet as well. And I'll tell you what, let's turn that off from being soloed, and zoom back here, and let's look at both of those pieces of animation together and see how it looks. Cool. Well, I think the timings need to change a little bit, but I'm already starting to like that. I think that looks pretty cool. I think it's a little slow, so I make that a little shorter, and maybe I can have these happen a little bit faster at the same time. Yeah, and if you want, we can even experiment with looking at these two lines don't necessarily all have to move together, so we could maybe drag these keyframes back 2 frames or so and see what that looks like. Actually, I think I like the symmetry. I was going to do the symmetry better this way. And it's kind of cool. It's almost like it sort of picks up this central shape here. So yeah, I kind of like that. That's sort of interesting. And what we could do is we could actually turn our diamonds off if you find those distracting, and go back now to Harry's Hats, our main comp, and let's preview what that looks like with the background happening at the same time. I think that looks awesome for now. I might want to adjust some of those timings, but I think we're off to a really good start here. Okay, so let's now work on the remaining pieces of our banner. Okay, so I'm going to jump back into my pre-comp, and what do we have left here? I'm going to select all, and I'm going to twirl down one of these arrows so I can kind of compress that down. Now I've got my left diamond and my right diamond. Awesome. Let me turn those on so I can see them. And now because we imported and retained the layer sizes, the anchor point on these diamonds defaults to being right in their center, which in this case is really convenient because I think I want them to kind of scale up and maybe rotate up a little bit. So having the center point, the anchor point being right in the center is awesome. Otherwise we'd have to kind of get in here, wouldn't be that hard, and make some guides and find out exactly, you know, where the center point is, and then drop and use the pan behind tool to set the anchor point right in the center, right? So let's start with this right one or whatever. So this kind of moves on here, and once this moves on around here, once it's about there, I guess I can start this. So let me press S and R now to show my scale and rotation. And I'm actually going to jump forward 10 frames from this exact point. So I'm going to hit Shift page down and jump forward 10 frames. I'm going to make a scale and rotation keyframe for this diamond at its normal settings of 100% and 0 rotation. Now I'll jump back, Shift page up to 10 frames before, and I am going to make this 0 and make this, let's see, I kind of want it to like click. And one thing, I don't think we've talked that much about rotation yet, but just a general note about rotation animation is don't overdo it. Because if things like spin too fast, they tend to look kind of silly or goofy. So usually, rotation's awesome, but you really want to control it. So in this case, maybe 45 degrees, or actually maybe negative 45 degrees, because I want it to be I think I want it to spin out to reinforce the screen direction, so I'm going to make this negative 45 degrees. All right, so the way that would move is now like that, in that direction, and actually it looks like too little, so I'm going to make this negative 90. Okay, and let me see what that looks like. I'll widen out my work area and widen back here, and I'll turn off my other diamond, and let's check this out. Cool. I think that's way too slow. I mean, the whole thing seems like too slow to me, but I think this should happen really quickly, like maybe 5 frames, maybe 6. Let's check that out. Or, you know, after, I'm going to undo that. Maybe after all my warning, maybe it's still not rotating enough, so maybe I was talking out of my butt there. So I'm going to make this one whole rotation, and let's see if that makes it a little bit peppier. That's almost too much. Also, it's the wrong direction. I'm going to make this 0. So now I'm futzing. I'm at the official futz stage. So let's make this negative 180. Okay, and let's see what that looks like. Yeah, that's better. Okay, I like that better. It's just got a little bit more rotation, and we could even still make this a little bit faster. So I'm going to move these up maybe like 3 frames. Yeah, I like that. Okay, great. So now I basically I could just copy these keyframes, right? Command C, copy them, go to my left diamond, and I could just paste them, Command V, right? So now that will do the rotation, except for I do want it to rotate the other way because it's on the other screen side. So let me get back in here, and where this is negative 180, let me just make this 180, okay? So now they will rotate, you know, in opposite directions. Yeah, cool. And maybe that's too fast. I don't know. Awesome, great. And let's look at that now back in our main comp with the background as well. All right, this is looking better and better all the time. So let's move on. Now you remember that I put this reference type here in Photoshop, and my plan was to actually import the real layers of this type from Illustrator to show you how you can mix Illustrator and Photoshop art in one composition. This is not something I'm going to ask you to do for your homework, so this is just kind of an instructive step, but it is instructive because oftentimes in the real world, you do have to mix many different kinds of layers from different applications and different kinds of artwork together. So this will just give you a taste of what that looks like. So let me go ahead and Command I and import my type from Illustrator rather, and press Options. And I'm going to import this as composition retain layer sizes. And I should note that even though I showed you every way to do this, this is almost always the way that I import layered art myself into After Effects. I have to show you all these ways because really they're all useful and they all have their time and place, and I do them all. But this is probably the way that I go most often because I do like things to default to having the anchor point at its own center for each layer. Okay, so I'm going to hit Open and import that in here, and here is my Illustrator comp up here in my project window. And if I want to pull this now into this comp that's open, this sort of active comp, there's a good shortcut for that. If you select it in the project window and you press Command and backslash, the slash that's under question mark, I think that's backslash, right? Boom. That will move it right into the center of the comp, which is usually where you want it, not in this case, okay? And now we need to line these two layers up. And I made this kind of tricky for myself because I made this one a little bit smaller and not in the same place, okay? This is actually something you do a lot in After Effects is line up a bunch of layers and make sure they're exactly lined up. So it's kind of something I wanted to show you how to do. So to make this easiest, I'm going to turn off my other layers except for the two Harry's Hats type layers. And additionally, I'm going to select them both, and I'm going to press T to reveal the opacity of both layers, and I'm going to click there and dial them both down to 50% opacity, okay, which is going to make it easier to tell when they're lined up precisely. All right, so now I need to explain something that is maybe going to be slightly confusing, but I hope not. But I need to make this bigger, okay? So every one of these letters needs to be slightly bigger, okay? Because here, if I drag this down, you'll see that Harry's hat, this one is slightly smaller than the reference one. I did this on purpose to be a big pain in my own butt, okay? And I actually did it so I could show you this one thing, which is normally what you would do when you want to scale up an Illustrator layer above 100%, you would click on the continuous rasterization button, as I showed you earlier on. And in fact, if we double click this and go into our pre-comp, that's exactly what we should do. We should select all of these in the pre-comp, okay? Turn it on here, because these are our original After Effects layers original Illustrator layers in After Effects, okay? So you need to press that button there, and now I'm going to go back here, and this is a thing about pre-comping that you should know, is that if I want to now have the whole composition be rasterized, once all the layers that button is pressed, I can now press this one here, and it will sharpen this, and I will show you that I can now scale this up as big as I want, right, and it'll still stay sharp. But if this is not pressed, that now looks crappy too. So that's the step. For an Illustrator layer that's in a pre-comp, you have to go back to the original spot, the original instance of it in a comp in After Effects, turn on the button there, and then turn it on for any pre-comp that it's in. Then you can make it bigger, okay? Whew. Hope that wasn't confusing. Now I'm going to dial this back down to 100 so that it is where it is. And now I'm going to look at this again. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Now I need to figure out how big to make this so that it lines up, right? So I need to kind of slowly scale this up. Oh, and it looks like I sort of got right there really quickly, which was not what I wanted to do. So here, I'll dial this down a little bit again, but about 105% scale, you can see it kind of clicks in place. And if I turn one or the other off, you can see that they're very close, right? So all I need to do now is just make sure that they're exactly lined up with one another, right? So let's just move. They're still set at 50%, right? And what I want to do is kind of like click this one. This one I don't want to move because that's my reference. In fact, I want to lock that for now. And here, oh, and by the way, I don't think I've explained this, but yeah, I did explain this in 25 steps. You want to lock this so that you can't click on this layer by accident. That's the lock button. You can always unlock or lock, right? So now here, I'll click on this layer, and I just want to get in there and make sure that it's lined up exactly. So if I like use my arrow keys, I can kind of like dial this down and up and just make sure that it's just right. And it looks like this is lined up very well right now, okay? So what I can actually do is make this 100% opacity again, and then if I turn this on and off, and let me unlock this and make this 100% opacity too, right? Lock that again. If I turn this on and off, now I can see, no, it's still a little bit off. So let me click this and move my arrow, using my arrow keys on my keyboard, I'm kind of just like moving this down a little, couple of pixels at a time. That looks like 1 pixel up now will do it. And now it's a few pixels off to the right, left. So I'm going to move it right, left using the arrows. Turn it off. I went too far. Move it back 1. And wow, it's really close. And it looks like maybe even the scale might be off a little bit. So I'm going to say this is close enough for baseball. And when it's within like a pixel or two, I think it's probably fine. And I'm going to turn this off, turn this back on, right, and turn on all my other layers there, right? So now I've got this, and this stays on, and everything else does exactly what it did before. And now I'm going to take this and move this down, and I could just take Harry's hat's ref and delete that, okay? So now this is in that place. And what's cool about this is that if I double click on this, like I did earlier, now I have individual control over each one of these letters, right? And additionally, it's only taking up 1 layer in my main comp, so that's kind of convenient rather than the 11 additional layers that I wouldn't want to pile in here, right? As I said in After Effects, you can get a lot of layers really quickly. So what's nice about this is now I can animate this in this discrete comp, all right? So let's go ahead and do that, and then we'll look at it back in our main comp. So I know that these letters are pretty much, I just want them to appear within this banner, okay? I'm kind of thinking that I want them to pop up one at a time and kind of animate on, maybe even with like a little bit of a bounce in them, right? So, and I want that all to appear within this comp. So first within that banner. So first let me do the little bit of animation, and then we can look back in the pre-comp and see what that's going to look like. So I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to move to about 1 second or so. I can even go back here, and what I'm looking for is the point at which my banner is completely drawn on enough for this animation to start happening. So here's kind of the first frame or so where I could even really be doing anything with this H. So I'll go back in here now, and what I could do is, this is kind of cool, you can take this little marker here and you can kind of drag this back and shift and lock this to my CTI. Now that I know that kind of represents the first frame at which something could be happening here. So I'm going to shift and page down and move 10 frames, and I'm going to press P and look at this. So now I'm going to make a position keyframe by clicking on the stopwatch, as always, and move back here to this marker, which is 10 frames previous. Now, if I move my H down, okay, here like this, and I'm holding down on shift, so it's just moving on the y-axis or down, there's a certain, I know at a certain point I'll be off the banner in the other comp, so I kind of want to check this. Is this far enough down? So if I jump back into my comp, looks like I am. I'm just below kind of the layer, the end of that gray banner there. So that's pretty good. That's sort of where I want this to be. Okay, and this will make more sense in 1 second. But if I kind of use this as a guide now, I'm gonna actually make a guide. I'm gonna Command R and make my rulers, and I'm gonna pull down a guide here to the top there. So I know now if I take all my letters and move them down there, they will be below that guide. I mean, below the end of the banner, right? Okay. So I made a little animation like this. And additionally, this is happening over 10 frames. And what I want to do is make that little bounce that I spoke of. So I'm going to use page down, and I'm going to move like 3 more frames into the future. And I'm going to take this and copy and paste this keyframe here, right? So that doesn't do anything. There's no change there because they're identical. And also because we've turned off that preference, right? That otherwise would put that little jog around in there. I hope you turned off that preference. Or turned default spatial interpolation to linear, I should say. So now we have no Bezier handles on this. And now to make this little bounce, I'm going to go to this. And this is kind of what's often known as an overshoot. Okay, and this is what I want to do. Is I want to have this go a little bit farther than it went. And you don't have to overdo this like crazy. I'm going to zoom in on this, and I'm going to hold down on shift when I do this, or I can adjust just the Y value here and just move this up a little bit. It really does not have to be that much, okay? And now it bounces up and overshoots and moves down, okay? And let's look at that to make sure the timings are right. So I'm going to set my work area kind of to surround that, B and N. Let's move back. Okay, and all right, so this is too slow, I think. I'm going to move this so it's a little faster, and I think even this reaction could be a little faster. Yeah, I kind of like that better. It's just a little more direct, right? So that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 frames. Let's see, even if we make this 6 frames, what that looks like. Too fast, okay. I like that better. And if we move this 1 frame back, the overshoot, let's see what that looks like. That's pretty gentle too. I don't know, I'm split. I think I like it a little bit faster. Again, the animator's job is making really minor changes and then seeing how they like those changes or not in motion. So this is not just me being totally neurotic, I think. Okay, great. So I like this animation. And basically I could just sort of recreate this now for every other layer fairly easily. And what I'll do is select them all and press P and make a position keyframe for all of them at their correct spot, right? And now I'll move down to this first frame of the animation and drag them all down so they line up on top and kind of snap it in there. And I held down on shift, right? So now they all do that, and now I'll move here. And what I could do actually is make a little guide for where my H went up to now here by dragging down. And now for this frame with all these selected, I can just move all these up until they click there too, right? So now I have this animation like this, which is kind of boring because they're all the letters are now moving at the same time, which is not what we want. Okay, so let me do that same thing kind of as before. I'm going to space all these keyframes out. And actually, I don't need these letters to exist before this first keyframe, so I'm going to select all of these, shift and select them all, and then this is widen back, and I'm going to kind of just grab the end there and click and cut those all there. I could have also hit Option bracket, as we've talked about, right? Option left bracket to start them all there, right? So now I want to offset them. So I'm going to select all of these and sort of do what I did before and kind of click this back, and then I'm going to hit Command and deselect that and click this back and Command, etc. Let me just quickly roll through all these and set them back. Which takes just a little bit longer, but not that long. And now let's check what that looks like. Right, so it's got like a little bit of a wiggle to it. And maybe that's cool. Maybe it's a little too slow, maybe not. But let's look at it in our main animation, and I want to explain something really cool, right? So here we are in our main comp, and let's look at that. Right, I think that's looking really fun, right? There's a lot of motion going on. So the cool thing is that because these are in a pre-comp, I can very easily put a mask, theme of the day is masks, okay, on this pre-comp to contain this animation so it looks like it's happening just within this gray barrier. Because obviously for right now it starts outside of it, right? But if I go here and I select my pre-comp of the type and I choose my rectangle tool again, make sure it's the rectangle, I can now get in here and make a mask around my type layer that fits exactly to the bottom of this, right? So I'm just going to mask this and draw a marquee around all this, and the top, I don't think it matters, but I'll set that right to the top of my gray banner as well, just in case, right? And just as long as it's containing it side to side, it doesn't have to go any further than that, right? So now I've got a mask here, and I'm not going to animate that, but check this out. So now it contains that shape in there. So these appear to be rising just from kind of within there. So let's check that out. I'm going to make a RAM preview, and let's check that. Okay, so that's still looking a little slow to me, so I'm going to go back into my type pre-comp, right? Click on that, and if I select all of my final sets of keyframes here, I can just like walk these back a couple of frames and just make this a little bit snappier, I think. The letters aren't covering that much distance, so, you know, I think the amount of time that I had them moving was just too long an amount of time for such a short distance. So let's look back in our main comp and see if we like that better. And by we, I mean me, of course. Yeah, I like that better. It's just got a little bit more snap to it or whatever, right? And, you know, it could even possibly happen a little bit later, but I don't want to futz this to death. Let's move on and look at our mustache. I was kind of thinking it would be fun if the mustache kind of popped up here from behind this banner and maybe had that little, like, a little bit of a wiggle to it, right? So the way I need to set the anchor point is for both of these layers is in the center here so that it can have that kind of little bend I was talking about. So I'm going to press Y for my pan behind tool. And here on my right mustache layer, I'm going to move this over and hold click and move it right there. And I'm going to do the same for the left mustache. Grab its anchor point and move that over and hold Command and click it there. So now, just so it's totally clear, I can rotate this one a little bit that way and this one a little bit that way and put a little bit of wiggle into it, right? So that might be fun. So let me, okay, so when do I want this to start happening? So sort of maybe as using the type moving up as a kind of reinforcement of this action. So I'll start this maybe in the middle here somewhere. And always remember when you're animating position, especially with something like a logo where it's very important that everything line up just right, that your first step is to make a position keyframe where it's in place, all right? Because if I move these, then, you know, it'll be impossible for me to just line these up exactly perfectly again. So first make the position keyframe of it in place, right? And now let's walk back a little bit. Let's see, maybe like 10 frames. Maybe I'll start with it a little bit longer. No, it's not that much motion, so let's walk back 10 frames, okay? And we can adjust the timings. And I'm going to pull this down and hold down on Shift. I'm going to be pulling it kind of straight down, right? And I want to hide it behind the banner here, right? And additionally, I'm going to move both of these down underneath the banner pre-comp so that it's hidden. Again, layer order equals visibility order, right? And I can also trim these layers so they start here now. And so let's see what that looks like. Yeah, it's going to be fun. So let's see. So now, actually, before I look at it, let's remember that we put the little bounce on the letters moving down. So let's up and down. So let's put that same little overshoot bounce here on the mustache. And that I think will help with our little rotation too. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3 frames on the mustache. And I will copy this position keyframe and copy this position keyframe. And now I'll move back to these keyframes and I'll select them both. And I'm going to kind of just pull these up a little bit and hold down on Shift. Again, it doesn't need to bounce up that high. Okay? And to me, this looks like it's probably going to be really slow again, but let's check it out. It's definitely fun, and you definitely feel that it's pulling up with the letters, all right? And it may be a little bit slow, but let's just work with it as it is now, and let's think about the rotation of this, okay? So the rotation that I want is kind of like it's moving up from its own center a little bit faster, and then the ends move up a little bit and then drop back down again, right? Sort of, again, 3-part action. So let's hit Shift and R and reveal our rotation as well, and do the same thing as starting at the end. We're going to kind of animate this backwards because we know we want it to land in this position with this rotation. So I'm going to click the stopwatch. Because I had them both selected, it made keyframes for both, right? And now I'm going to go back to the start, okay? And I'm going to actually hit solo on these 2 layers so it's not hidden for a sec so I can see them, so I see what I'm doing. I think I want this to be down a little bit like that, maybe, and this to be the opposite, like -10, right? So it starts off like that. I actually need to make sure that it's still behind my banner, and it's not, because I rotated it down a little. So if I select both of these now, making sure that I'm at my first position keyframe here, I can just kind of use my arrow keys to nudge these up so that they're now again hidden, right? And so right now I'm going to solo those again, and now right now it's animating in the rotation in a way that like I want it to hit a different point here. I want it actually to be still rotated there, so maybe I want these 2 rotation points here actually, and then have it kind of fall down into place, right? So like more like that. Except for now it looks like it's moving up, which I don't want. So maybe I rotated these in the wrong direction. So I thought what I wanted was this to be down. Oh, I see what I did. Okay, I forgot a step. Right, so these were correct here at the beginning. Teacher error, okay? And then when I get here, actually, it's hitting, so it's kind of at a wider point here, right? So what I want to do is actually widen these out so that it's like up above. So I'll make this one -10. Actually, that might be too much, but let's see what it looks like. And then this one 10, okay? So let's try that out, right? So it kind of like moves up. And I think what I want is for this animation to start rotating later, because for the most part it's all just facing up, and then when it hits, that's kind of when I want it to click. So actually I wonder if I take these and I move these now, actually all the rotation keyframes, and put a little bit of overlap, this might make this a little bit better. Something like that. Yeah, it gives a little bit more of a waggle to it, right? So it's a little bit less connected now to the position animation, so it feels like it has a little bit of flap to it. So in case that wasn't clear, so I've got it, you know, down in the down position as it's moving up, because it's moving rather quickly, and then it's sort of like when it hits the wall, it sort of unfolds a little bit and then settles back down, okay? So that's kind of the animation I settled on, and it happens fairly quickly. And what I did is I offset it so it looks like it's continuing to just move up a little bit and rotate up although it has like some momentum behind it, okay? And I think to make the illusion of this even better, I can make this a little bit faster now. Let's see. I kind of like that better, right? That's pretty fun. So let's look at that with everything else and make sure that the timings line up, because we don't want this to sort of overstep our type animation. So maybe we can walk this back a few frames. And so let's look at this all together, and I'll zoom back out and set my work area. Yeah, that's pretty fun. And maybe it's a little too fast now. Of course, I want to get in here with these timings, and you know, what's kind of a nice thing to do sometimes, this is a great trick, is if you want to stretch out the timings for everything but leave the ratio of the keyframes to one another in place, if you select all the keyframes and then you click down on Option and hold down on it, and you drag from the end keyframe on this side or on this side, right? You can't drag from the middle one here. And I could, if I drag this, I'm now kind of keeping the relationship but widening the whole thing. And so let's see what that looks like. Cool. So I'm digging that. So then all we need to do really is move on to our hat and figure out a good way for our hat to animate. And now let's think about this for one sec. We have quite a lot of options because we could use rotation or scale or position or opacity or any combination of those things, right? So I thought it'd be kind of fun to try out some rotation, and maybe a rotation and scale animation together, right? So always before doing a rotation and scale animation, you just want to check that the anchor point is where you want it. And I think in this case I want it to be in its own center. Yeah, I think that's a good place for this to start. So again, just making sure I want to press S and make a scale keyframe, and then press Shift R and make my rotation keyframe. So now this is my final position, right? And now let me hit Shift and page up and move like 10 frames down, forward, or whatever. And maybe I'll have this do one whole rotation and scale up from 0. Okay, so I'm going to do that. And I'm also going to Option and left bracket and trim this layer right here. I could have also dragged over the end, right? Like we've talked about a billion times now. Okay, so now this kind of like does this fun like wow kind of rotation scale up thing here. And this is probably too fast, so let me add some time in here, and I'm just going to preview just that. Why don't we try moving the anchor point? Even with the animation in place, we could try moving the anchor point, and it won't mess anything up. Move this down to the bottom. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, I think that's more the animation. It looks more like the way a magician would move it or something. In fact, what if we try something even different and now move this anchor point all the way down like here so that it's like in the middle of this banner? What does that look like? Okay, well it over-rotates and it's on top of the banner, but let's say we get it to start around 90, okay, instead of 180, right, like 90 degrees here, and 0. Now that should be able to come up, right? Okay, and now let's move that underneath the mustache and banner and see what that looks like. I don't know. I think maybe the anchor point should be under the mustache now instead. Maybe that's the way to do it. I think that's more fun. Additionally, we can build in a little bit of an overshoot and get the timings right here. So I think I used 1, 2, 3, 4, 14 frames for some random reason. So let me go 10, okay, and move this here. And now back up like 2 or 3 frames. And let me copy and paste these frames here, okay? And then what I will do is I will increase the scale to 110 for the overshoot, and the rotation I'll just overshoot it a little bit manually, like -10 degrees or whatever, and let's see what that looks like. That's got a little fun to it, right? Cool. And now what we need to do is kind of get the timings right so that maybe could even start right at the peak of this moving up. Oops. And select my whole layer, make sure I have my V arrow selected. And yeah, something like that. Put that maybe like there. Okay, and let me move the work area back to the beginning, and let's preview the whole thing. Yeah, that's pretty silly. Maybe the rotation is happening a little too fast, the rotation in the scale on the top hat, and maybe it's coming a little too quick after that. So I'm going to take these and move these maybe 1 or 2 more frames down. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, I think that's pretty funny. Now, again, I feel like now I've made the mustache animation too long, so I'm going to take this and move this down a couple of frames and see if I can shorten that, and now move this a couple of frames forward. Try this out. It looks like it loses a little time, like it's moving faster at the start, and then this is a little too long to me, and then this is probably going to be okay, but I think I need to adjust the middle timings on this. So this is pretty instructive because it'll force me to adjust my timings later. So let me get in here and have Harry's hats, the banner, happen a little bit faster, so I'll double click in there. And I'm going to select all by Command A, and then I'm going to press U to reveal all of the animation in all of these layers, right? And I think it's happening too slow, so why don't I take these, which is my top line and bottom line, and my banner, and move these all up a couple frames, right? So it's happening faster. And then have Harry's, and then have the diamonds happen a little bit sooner too by dragging just these keyframes up, right? So I want these to happen probably right there, as soon as that hits that point, right? So now I can go back here and I could probably, well, let's look at the timings first, but I was going to say I could probably pull my type layer up a little bit too. But I think that's looking much better, so let's have the type start as soon as it can. It's about here, right? So now I'm going to jump back into this pre-comp, and I will take all these layers and pull them up, right? And go back to my comp. Yep, and that's right. Okay, so let's check that out. Yeah, I think that's looking good. And I want this to feel like 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's always good. The rule of threes is always good in animation, right? So 1, 2, 3. And that's pretty good. 1, 2, 3. Okay, now that we're done with our animation and we love it, and it's a total work of art that belongs in a museum, let's say we're done with that and move on to something else, which I think is really fun, actually. You'll notice that I designed this black and white and in shades of gray. So what I'd like to do as a final step, and what I'd like you also to do in your homework as the final step, is apply colors to this in After Effects. Now, we're going to need to get into a kind of a new area, which is about effects, okay? Like up here, you see the word effect? After Effects is called After Effects because, I think, because of the number of effects that you could put on any layer, which there's a ton of different effects. There's so many that actually, I don't even want to get into all of them today, and I just want to talk a little bit about color correction effects, okay? Because those are kind of very useful. They work well with graphics, and they're just something that you're always going to need to do. So, okay, let's start with our background. Now, this is just basically a solid color, so what I want to do first is get rid of this, turn this off, and make a solid here in After Effects. That's a great color. And so, hit Command Y, and, you know, choose a nice color that you like. Yeah, I like this blue tone that we got here. And so I'm going to choose that. And that defaults to putting it sort of above the layer you had selected. So I'm going to just, oh, actually, it's in the right place there. So I could delete my background. And why I was confused is because my background lines are barely even showing up here. You can sort of not even see them. So now we need to put an effect on those. Okay, so if you select this, to put an effect on any layer, you select the layer, then you go up to Effect, and then you see there's a whole ton of things you can choose from. But we're just going to go into Color Correction, and you can see there's still a whole ton of things to choose from in here, so we're going to be pretty selective in what we do. We're going to choose Hue and Saturation, okay? And this is basically identical, if you're a Photoshop person, to the Hue Saturation effect that you find in Photoshop, right? So I'm going to click this, and now I have my effects panel to open up over here. Yours might default to being behind your project window. So wherever it is, it doesn't matter, just a place where you can find it, but mine's over here, okay? So now, with this layer selected and I've got my effect on, I can now check this box to colorize, right? Now you can start to see the layer begin to show up. And now what I want to do is change the colorize hue till it gets to something kind of in the range of something that's going to look good here, like maybe a bluish or a greenish, right? And you can kind of see what color you're putting it at by looking here. And then I can up the saturation, for example, or the lightness, or both, right? Start to make this just a little bit more exciting looking. If you press this button here that says FX, you'll turn it off. So you can kind of like turn it off and turn it on to compare what you've done. And I think this looks a lot nicer already. So I'm going to leave it there for the moment being. So now that we've changed that, you see the Harry's Hats banner, it's sort of gray here and doesn't look so good. Now we kind of have two choices. What we could do is we could select the banner pre-comp and we could go back up here and go to color correction and go and just say choose our hue and saturation effect just like we did. Now what that will do is we'll apply this effect to all parts of this comp at the same, of the pre-comp rather, at the same time, right? So if I colorize this, I'll be colorizing the gray banner as well as the black diamond and the black stripes. So you won't be able to see that unless I really turn this up. But there you go. Now you can see I'm kind of affecting all those things at once. And you might or might not want that. Just say you want to leave these stripes and the diamonds black, but you want to affect just the banner. Okay, so now you have to jump into the banner pre-comp, select the banner layer, and now go up to effect and put hue saturation effect on that. The effect that you just used, it puts right below effect controls there, so that's pretty useful if you're kind of always putting the same effect on like we are in this case, right? So now let me colorize this, and I kind of have to remember now where my color, what color range I was in, but that shouldn't be too hard. So let me drag up the saturation a little bit and move the color hue over till we get into kind of a bluish range, right? And now let me jump back into my pre-comp and see what that looks like. So, it might be a little clashy still, so why don't I jump back into the banner, and I think maybe I should like darken this and maybe unsaturate it a little bit, and let me look at that now. Okay, and this is good actually, because now that it's a little bit darker, what we could also do is put an effect on the type pre-comp, since we'd want to change every letter to be the same exact color. So if I wanted to make this white, now that we've made the background of this gray, what was gray, a little bit darker, I could make this white, and that'd be kind of fun. So what I could do is, instead of adding a hue saturation effect, I can add a different effect. I can go up to Effect and Generate Fill. Okay, so this is just like what you might expect. It fills in the letters in this case. It defaults to being this obnoxious red. I'm not quite sure why. I think maybe just because it's so visible. But if you click up in here and then over here, you can drag this up and make this white and hit OK. And now you can see that I've made the type layer white as well, which is kind of nice. And now that I look at it, actually, I could add another effect to this type to just make it maybe a little bit nicer. If I click on that and go up to Effect, I can pull down here to Perspective and then put on a drop shadow, right? So let me click on this drop shadow, right? And that always sometimes looks good on type, makes it stand out a little bit better. And so there you see it just automatically puts this little drop shadow on. And I could change the opacity of the shadow, or I could change the softness of the shadow, or whatever, give it a little bit of a softer look, right? And I could also change the distance of it or whatever, but I think it was at a pretty good distance there. So yeah, so I kind of like that. I'll just dial that down a little bit, and I think that looks nice. It makes it stand out a little bit more. So now you can see this all stays on the animation, and it just works with what you've already pre-built, which is really cool the way this works. All right. So I think you're getting the hang of it. Let's give the mustache a color as well. Okay. So something like the mustache now, it has texturing on it, some subtle texture. So we wouldn't want to do like a fill effect, because that would just like fill the entire layer. So something like hue saturation is probably the way we want to go here as well. So I'm going to put that on, Effect, Color Correct, Hue Saturation. And what's cool here is I can colorize this and, up the saturation a little bit and find like a nice color for this. And yeah, maybe like a darker blue like that. I kind of think that's cool, actually. So what I could do is just copy this effect up here, Command C, copy that, and now select my left mustache, and just Command V, paste that on there, and now that color correct is on there too, right? So let's check that out, because I think we don't actually want to color correct the top hat, because I think that should stay black. So let's see what this looks like. Cool, so it's just got a little bit of color to it, and it's really fun, and that was a pretty easy thing to add on, right? We're going to talk a lot more about effects, don't you worry, but color corrects are some of the first ones I think you should start with. There's many effects, like I said, and they can be a little bit confusing, and they can also be way too much, and you should definitely always try to have a kind of a light hand when it comes to applying effects. But these color correct ones are a great place to start. All right, so I definitely think this makes it look a lot more fun, and really, honestly, color correcting in After Effects is a really good way to go. It's got a lot of powerful tools to do that. Okay, like I said up top, this was a really big lesson, and I crammed a lot of things in here. Just to reiterate for 1 second, we definitely talked about the differences between Photoshop and Illustrator in terms of After Effects primarily, and also how to import things into After Effects, which is really important, okay? The only other thing that I think I brought up that was basically as important is the idea of masking and animated masks. I'm hoping that masks will be something that you'll be able to use from now on to save your butt, or to help you out, or to cut out a little part of something, just to make your life a lot easier in the future in After Effects, okay? So thank you so much for watching this. I think you should head on over now to the homework video, which you'll watch next, and yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks a lot.
If you had a microscope and could look at a piece of a leaf, you would see thousands of tiny openings which branch out until the leaf has all of the materials it needs. What happens now?